40 years ago, Stuart Gillespie had dedicated his career to researching and solving undernutrition. His path was cemented in fighting child hunger, what he believed to be a major threat and violation of human rights. In Gillespie's mind, this was the food crisis causing the most devastation across the globe.
But over time, it became clear, especially in this century, the last 25 years, and especially in the last 10 years of that we were dealing with a much broader problem in as much as it was really going back to what really should be called malnutrition, i.e. poor nutrition, inadequate nutrition. And that can be both with regard to deficit or deprivation, undernutrition in terms of energy, protein, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals. And it is also the massive and increasing issue of overweight and obesity, which has multiple detrimental consequences: chronic disease, diabetes, cardiovascular, potential cancers, and so on. So the entire spectrum suddenly became broader.
Gillespie could no longer focus on just one extreme. He realized that both hunger and obesity were branches of the same root issue, the global food industry. More specifically, the greed of the global food industry. To understand how one sector holds so much of human health in the palm of its hand, we have to look back at the decisions made around the time of World War II.
There was a set of policy decisions. Theodore Roosevelt in the US, even before that in the Great Depression, realized he had to really ensure food security, prevent famine, prevent issues around the Great Depression at that time. And in the Marshall Plan and the rebuilding of Europe after the Second World War, there was a Bengal famine in India. So it was about mass producing cheap calories to prevent famine, but also to use what became an overproduction of some of these staple foods to use as food aid strategically to stop the spread of communism.
These food aid programs can also be stripped down to less PR-friendly terms, like sugar dumping and milk dumping. This practice is when food manufacturers use the guise of charity to offload their extra product on poorer countries. While legitimate food aid programs can be a crucial lifeline, manipulating it through dumping schemes hurts the local agriculture and economy, which creates long-term market instability in these areas.
And that was all incentivized and enabled by big agricultural subsidies that were granted to certain corporations to mechanize the food system, to modernize it, to focus on especially corn, soy, wheat, rice, to increase the production of calories, essentially, through these staple foods.
But even after the basic needs were met and we were no longer under threat of a global famine, the industry never evolved. In fact, the food manufacturers doubled down on the model, and their only pivot was viewing food as a commodity instead of a necessity.
And because of that, the system became increasingly financialized. And as part of that, investors were coming in, hedge funds, asset fund managers, buying up big shares from Nestle, from General Mills, from Unilever, Coca-Cola, PepsiCo, Kraft Heinz, Mondelez, General Mills, and putting the emphasis on profit at all costs, at any cost. So as that evolution of this food system was happening, driven very much by an increasing capture of the system by large corporations, just a handful of them, almost like monopolies. They're more oligopolies. They're a handful, and they operate together. They communicate together to ensure that no one gets in their way, especially governments. As all this was happening, I realized I really needed to shine a light on what was going on in the private sector.
Gillespie's findings are published in his new book, Food Fight: From Plunder and Profit to People and Planet. In it, he argues that the core reason behind years and years of global health crises is simply that ultra-processed foods are the most profitable products. And since the worldview of food has shifted from necessity to luxury, profit will always be above health. Gillespie says we have been purposefully locked into this system through specific actions taken by the food industry.
Through various means, they have used their market and financial power to translate into political power. And I talk about the deadly Ds. So, they're sowing doubt on the science of the harms of these products. There's the issue of distorting the narrative, issues of conflict of interest, which are rife throughout the entire system, issues of distraction, where small-scale little corporate social responsibility initiatives are effectively positioned, very media-friendly, very high visibility, but they're small.
These initiatives are helpful and do good work for communities, but Gillespie says that they're often used to distract from the much larger damage these corporations do. Another tactic Gillespie points out is the food industry's ability to hide within trade associations, which are influential voices at policy conferences advising on regulations.
Sort of act like Trojan horses in big policy conferences, again, to get to the policy table to say, actually, we're dealing with it, leave us alone, we'll be fine. We're going to actually voluntarily regulate ourselves. It never happens, or if it does, it's very much delayed and watered down. That's the kind of disguise technique. And the final one is dodging, which often relates to things like tax dodges, because they can choose to locate their tax liabilities around the world wherever there's a low tax jurisdiction.
These maneuvers are all made with one goal in mind: power.
The system revolves around the lock-in and the control and the capture of power, market, financial, what I would also call epistemic power of a story, and that relates to the way media pick up stories, and then political power is used to keep the status quo.
All to maximize profit, regardless of who gets hurt. But when the injured party is humanity, how is such a devastating operation able to thrive for so long? The winning strategy is easier to understand if we zoom in on one section of this industry. We recently spoke with Susan Greenhall for a segment about her book, Soda Science, which traces Coca-Cola's trajectory to becoming a global beverage giant. She revealed how instead of fighting back against health research, the company embraced the scientists. And while it looked like a show of good faith to the public, this acceptance allowed Coca-Cola to pull strings behind the scenes and shape the scientific narrative however they pleased. Gillespie says a similar thing is happening with the food industry as a whole. But instead of soda science, they've leaned into the entire research area of nutritionism.
Nutritionism is basically saying the issue isn't food and it's about the nutrient composition of foods. And what that does is take emphasis away from potential harms that are being generated through the processing, ultra processing aspect. They just say, oh, no, that's no big deal. That's nothing. We need to just lower the saturated fats, lower the sugar and salt. And yes, that does help. That does improve healthiness. But we do know, and there's quite strong evidence, especially from the US, that something else important is going on that relates to ultra processing. And anything when you talk about ultra processing is fundamentally corporate and it's large scale and it relates to the behaviors and the products and the practices of the large corporations that need reining in.
By focusing on specific nutrients, the industry is able to once again distract from the core issue of ultra-processed food.
They're very happy to have that focus because they can play around with the different levels. It's fine for them. It's no big deal. But it's when the spotlight gets shone on their whole modus operandi, which is about processing a whole array of different products to maximize profit, to enable demand to continue at high levels, even though basically they're the same products, they're just different colors or, they don't want the light shone on the ultra processing side. And now that more evidence is coming up on the harms of that, we know that nutritionism is a failed approach to looking at the problem and ultimately to addressing it.
Gillespie says we need to zoom out and use all of the context to approach this problem. It's not simply an issue of how much protein is in a product. Real change comes from looking at the entire ecosystem of this industry.
We need to have more researchers working in nutrition who are not just looking at what's inside the food and working with different levels, but look at the entire political and the commercial aspect of the system and being able to talk across those boundaries to challenge what they will discover are problems and also, importantly, come up with solutions. So there are big challenges for researchers to get a bit more political about looking at this kind of black box of the political economy of nutrition, which when I grew up, we were told to stay away from politics. That has to change.
There's a relatively new area of research that seems to be a step in this direction, called commercial determinants of health. It was defined in the last decade and studies how the private sector impacts public health, either positively or negatively. This includes factors like supply chains, product packaging, lobbying practices, and targeted marketing.
We have been slow in the food world to pick that up. because I think we need to say, look, wherever the causes lie, at what level, from immediate to more kind of distant, we should be engaging as researchers with understanding what is going on, because we should be engaging with trying to turn it around. And you can't do that unless you really know what's going on. And therefore, I think it's naive to just ignore politics. It's naive to ignore the kind of profit motivation. There's nothing necessarily wrong with profit if the parameters in the system have been set by government to say this is allowed, this isn't allowed, these products are allowed, these aren't. If that is done, you can make profit within that, and there's no problem with that. So this is not about killing capitalism necessarily. It's about a more human-focused and planet-focused approach to development and to society and the economy, essentially.
While Gillespie's book outlines all of the damage done by the food industry, it also provides a framework of solutions he believes will evolve the system into a model that benefits humanity. Tune in next week to hear Gillespie outline what he believes can save consumers before the system gets too out of control to wrangle back in. His book, Food Fight, is available now. You can find more information about Stuart Gillespie and all of our guests on our website, radiohealthjournal.org. Our writer-producer is Kristen Farah. Our executive producer is Amira Zaveri. I'm Elizabeth Westfield.